Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Hello and welcome to Then and Now. I'm your guest host, Fernando Pérez-Montesinos, Associate Professor of the Department of History at UCLA. The 1960s and 1970s saw the rise of multiple repressive military governments in Latin America, driven by a dogmatic Cold War mentality and in the name of national security. Military regimes from Guatemala to Argentina embarked on a systemic crackdown on real and perceived political dissidents that resulted in the decimation of the rule of law and a wide tail of human rights violations, including torture, kidnappings, extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, displacements, and even genocide. But beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Cold War came to an end and democratically elected governments replaced military rule, groups of activists and human rights organizations through Latin America began their long struggle to expose the perpetrators, and in some cases, as in Argentina, secure a few convictions through newly created truth commissions and other legal mechanisms. Despite the demands of grassroots organizations that saw the need for a truth commission, Mexican authorities seemed indifferent to all of these developments. But a presidential decree on October 2021 under the administration of AMLO promised to change that. With the government seemingly sympathetic to historical victims groups, efforts to produce such a report finally began that year. In this episode, we discuss Mexico's Dirty War and the story behind the creation and subsequent neglect of Fue el Estado, the country's most comprehensive report on state violence between 1965 and 1990. We will be speaking with Professor Carlos Pérez Ricart. Carlos Pérez Ricart is Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics in Mexico City. Between 2021 and 2024, he served as one of the 4 members of the Mexican Truth Commission, responsible for investigating human rights violations that occur during this period. He holds a PhD in political science from the Free University of Berlin and a degree in international relations from El Colegio de México. His most recent publications include the edited volume Gun Trafficking and Violence from the Global Network to the Local Security Challenge, and La Historia de los Agentes Antinarcóticos de Estados Unidos en México, published both in 2022. So Professor Pérez Ricart is a columnist also for the newspaper Reforma, and we are very lucky to have him today in this episode. Welcome, Carlos.
Thanks so much, Fernando, for the opportunity. Thank to you, thank you to Rose, and to everyone involved in the recording of this podcast. Thanks so much.
So the report Fue el Estado documents multiple forms of state violence between 1965 and 1990, roughly speaking. This period is commonly known in Mexico as the Dirty War. So can you give us some context to understand the history of this period?
Yes, of course, Fernando. As you know, as in many other countries in Latin America, Mexico suffered an authoritarian regime during practically the entire 20th century, right? But unlike other countries in the region, such as Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, it was not a military dictatorship. It was a somewhat strange regime here. It was a continuity of civilian governments that nevertheless maintained a very authoritarian conversation with large parts of Mexico's society. It was not a democratic regime. Despite being a civilian government, it had many similarities with its military counterparts in Latin America, such as Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. In particular, during the period 1965 and 1990, the Mexican state used authoritarian practices to dismantle social movements and dissidents of all kinds. During those years, torture, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial executions were abused and occurred. Of course, these practices began before 1965 and were perpetuated after 1990. What is relevant is that during these 25 years, serious human rights violations were widespread and generalized in Mexico. Rather than a dirty war, I prefer to speak of a period of state violence in which as a yet undetermined number of people were murdered or were disappeared. Official figures speak of some 1,200 killed, another 1,000 disappeared. The truth, Fernando, is that we will never know the real number of those who were murdered or disappeared.
Thank you, Carlos, for providing that useful context. So were there any efforts before 2021, before the Truth Commission that you took part on? Were there any efforts to write a similar report of the nature of Fue el Estado? What were some of the factors you think prevented efforts in that direction?
Yes, it certainly is the case. The work of the historical mechanism where I belong and the Truth Commission in which I participated, and I want to be very clear on that, is just one point in the long struggle for truth and justice in Mexico. It's one more of many voices, of many causes, of many people. Many of them we don't know their names that have been fighting for truth and justice in Mexico. It is worth remembering that already in the 1970s, when all of this happened, women's groups were fighting in dissent, the Colectivo Eureka, for instance. There are victims groups that have been fighting for more than 50 years to shed some light on the past. More specifically, a special prosecutor's office was established in the year 2001 to investigate crimes in the past. Unfortunately, it failed due to lack of political support. It was a great failure because at that time, in the year 2001, when for the first time another party came into power, many perpetrators of crime were still alive and in office. So it would have been an excellent opportunity to try to solve those crimes. And the opportunity to build a new regime was lost. I am really certain, Fernando, that it was the state Fue el Estado, while an important stepping stone on the road to historical clarification, is only part of the effort that neither begins with us nor ends with us. It will be the work for another scholars and activists to follow the paths described in Fue el Estado.
So in that sense, you and the Truth Commission inherited a tradition of demands from grassroots organizations that tried to bring some of the perpetrators to justice and form some sort of framework to accountability in Mexico. So this is only the last step in a longer history.
Like in every other country, right? When you see other examples of truth and then justice, you will see that it's not just one commission on one person, but a long story of people working together in order. It's more a process than a single result.
So, personally, what moved you to undertake this project, and then through your lens and through your personal approachment to the Truth Commission and to the report, can you tell us also a little bit of the background, a story on how the idea of the report in general came about?
Yeah, I have just arrived in Mexico after 10 years out of the country. I was living in Germany and the UK for 10 years. And I had studied very carefully the archives of Mexico that are in the United States, more importantly in the National Archives and Record Administration in Maryland. And I had the hint that in some aspects, looking at the archives that are in the US, Mexican archives that are in the US, we might learn more about Mexican political system than just looking at archives in Mexico. So I thought it was like my experience in that regard might have been helpful for that. And I thought I could contribute a lot to the study of major human rights violations and put all this experience and ability into this effort. Despite not having achieved all these objectives, I'm certain that having participated in the commission from 2021 to 2023 is one of the greatest honors of my life.
So can you tell us a little bit about the general project? So how not only you, but other people came about with the idea of forming teams, and can you walk us through the process of the report, of probably the writing of the report?
Yes, of course, and yeah. First of all, no one teaches you how to run a truth commission, right? There are no best practices. There are no books. It's a great experiment, and every commission is different. When you see the history of other commissions in Latin America, you will notice that they are all that it's complicated the writing, because you have to deal with 3 or 4 or 5 different people that come from different backgrounds, disciplines, and have also different expectations on what a truth commission really is. So it wasn't easy to delimit topics, period, regions, and it's a continuous conversation with people that are your peers, right? So there are no hierarchies there. In the end, what I can tell you is that we had an incredible team of more than 50 people who managed to interview more than 1,200 people throughout the country, most of them victims of the dirty war, and people that didn't talk to any other commission or any other project in the past. So these are new testimonies that were not part of the official narrative of that particular period. In total, the team of researchers made more than 120 field trips throughout the Mexican Republic. The goal was that everyone who wanted to talk could have the opportunity to do so. Obviously, we didn't manage to reach everyone that was a victim in the period, but I think this is a good example of those who were victimized and their families as well. In addition to the interviews, our team reviewed documents from more than 96 federal, state, and private archives throughout the country. I'm not aware of any other work like this, more comprehensive like this. 96 different archives. Some were open to the public, but some weren't, and we were the first entering to those archives and to try to discover what they have, and more importantly, what they don't have. We discovered, for instance, that there is no police archive in Mexico in general. So it's impressive how one of the cornerstones of the political system does not have any archive at all. Imagine that this happens in the US. Of course, you have an archive of the FBI or the DA or the CIA. It's not the case in Mexico, where you have really very little information about how public security forces use to work. Again, I have no doubt that this is the most ambitious project to shed light on serious human rights violation during this period. So the report, Fernando, is organized in 6 central parts. I would invite everyone that is listening to this podcast to go to our webpage and to take a look on that. The first part of the report deals with the facts. It tries to answer the question, what happened between 1965 and 1990. The second part deals with the causes. It tries to answer the question, why did it happen? The third part answers the question of the implications of this violence. to answer the questions of the consequences of the grave violations. Here, Fernando, the starting point is that not all victims suffered violence in the same way or were assaulted for the same reasons. Every victim had a particular context, and we have to understand it. If they were indigenous, if they were women, if they were children at that time, they had also different there were different consequences for their in how they violated. The fourth part deals with the perpetrators. It identifies them by name and surname. In total, this part covers more than 500 names or surnames of those who perpetrated violence in Mexico. The sixth part deals with the persistent factors, that is, the reasons why the events described in the report continue to occur in the present. It is the part that seeks to link the past with the present. It's not just it's not about the past. The report is also about the present and how the past continues refigurating our present. And the last part deals with recommendation. The question here is how to prevent it from continuing to happen. This is one of the pillars of the transnational system, right? The no repetition. It's the search for no repetition, and we thought that our report had to deal with that. We felt that the report should have a section that, in light of history, would inform us about mechanisms to prevent state actors from continuing to violate human rights. In total, it's a report from more than 5,000 pages, and is completely available to download on the internet.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for that thorough answer. So let's move on and discuss the findings of the report, starting very generally and perhaps focusing on one or two key examples that the investigation yielded. So can you tell us a little bit about the findings, the scope of the violence, geographically speaking, the incidence of these events of state of human rights violations, the number of perpetrators, a little bit about the institutions involved. Was this a federal campaign, or were other local municipal authorities also involved? So geography, frequency, and then perhaps the state actors.
Of course. Let me be as brief as possible. I will point out three of the main findings of the report. First, that state violence was more widespread than we originally thought. When we talk about the dirty war in Mexico, we always give the examples of 1968, the massacre de Tlatelolco, and 1971, what is labeled as the Halconazo. But there were way more massacres during that time. We counted more than 43 massacres perpetrated by state actors during these 25 years. Okay, so violence was more widespread than we thought, more widespread regionally, and in the type of victims. So it was not just it was not Guerrero and Sinaloa and urban settings. It was across the country. We discovered that the state, and I think this is one of the main findings, and I think one of the main contributions for the historiography in Mexico, the state forces were not only focused its violence against insurgent groups, something that we already knew, but against all types of social dissidences, against anyone who dared to question the authoritarian regime in Mexico. Until now, these victims had been left out of the focus of research on the period. And the main finding, and also the main methodological idea or the methodological approach of the report was really to focus on those victims that didn't belong to insurgent groups that were also victims of state forces. Okay, many people would argue that they were not political opponents. Indeed, they were not political, even though with Michel Foucault, I do believe that everything is political. But the fact is that they were neglected by the historiography, and they were abused by state forces over that time. And we thought that we had to put them in this report. So this is one of the main findings also of the archive. A second major finding is that, as you said before, that violence was not only perpetrated by the military or intelligence agencies, such as the Dirección Federal de Seguridad or the Dirección General de Investigaciones Políticas y Sociales, but really by a huge range of local, subnational, and national organizations, okay? Police forces in general. Human violation was widespread across all these police forces, even if they were local or had state nature. It's important to review the subnational focus and not just only try to understand this from a national perspective, but also from a local perspective. Finally, a third finding is that state violence was not limited to the 1970s, as most of the literature indicated. In many areas and towards many different dissidencies, violence in the 1980s was more vicious and more systematic than in the 1970s. So this disputes the main idea that while in the 1970s a lot happened, more and more in the 1980s, the state regime was less violent, which was not the case in many facts and in many regions. The 1980s were more violent than the 1970s. So this would be the three main findings: the scope of the violence towards other groups, the fact that violence was not only perpetrated by the military. It was, of course, perpetrated by the military, but also by subnational actors. And third, that the 1980s were also as cruel and violent as the 1970s.
Perfect. Then can you tell us a little bit about these other groups that were not traditionally seen as the target of state violence? Are we talking about women, indigenous peoples, Afro descendants? Are we talking about like ordinary rural folks who were protesting some sort of infrastructural project? Can you break down for us a little bit the different groups that the report found were also subjected to forced disappearances, torture, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, what we discover is that violence was not just against armed counterinsurgency groups, but also against groups and people that were, for instance, doing politics as usual, that belong to political parties, which try to change stuff from a very much establishment setting. Even in the PAN, which is a right-wing country, a party, people were tortured and were killed. More importantly, in the PRD, which is a political organization that wanted to change stuff from the institutional arrangements, many of their militants were killed or disappeared. So we really try to shift focus on those groups. For instance, student movements, urban popular movements, labor and union movements, political parties, human rights defenders, and to everyone who really refused to accept some sort of normativity from the state, behaviors, discourses, events that were not part of the establishment were also persecuted, and we try to shed some light on that. Of course, this is just the beginning of a big goal in order to study this further on, but I think that we are at least at the very beginning of this historiographical change for Mexican historians.
So the report, for instance, documents violence not only against civilians, but sometimes police forces would torture police members. And in some cases, the report also documents that some military members were also, well, they also faced state violence because they probably disobeyed some of the commands from high-ranking military officers. And also, on the other hand, it's not only Mexicans in some cases who are the target of the state violence by the Mexican state, but the report also, for instance, documents cases in Chiapas where Guatemalan refugees in the 1980s, for instance, were also subject to not only discriminatory practices, but violence not only from the Mexican authorities, but also from members of the Guatemalan military. So there's a number of unexpected and unusual, if you will, cases. What can
Yes.
you? Mm-hmm.
Of course, at the very beginning, I have to admit, we didn't contemplate those groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
It was during our trips and fieldworks in Mexico when we started to talk to people that started talking about this to us. So we didn't found anything about these about violation against these two group of people while we were just writing the methodological approach and this sort of stuff. But it came to us when we start going across the country and talking to people. So after many meetings, mothers and fathers and sisters and siblings from victims approached us and told us about these stories. Hey, my dad was disappeared because he disobeyed an order of their command because he didn't want to kill someone or to torture someone. So these are very good examples of how this is more a process than a result, because we didn't have an idea, a clue of that. And in the end, I think we had more than 50 cases of people that suffer violence within the armed forces. And regarding the people from Guatemala that were killed and disappeared and tortured in Mexico Soul, it was exactly the same. We went to Chiapas, and we then started talking to victims of that period, and then doing our own research on that. We spent a lot of time in Chiapas trying to really how to explain what happened exactly there, and why was, for instance, the Guatemalan army able to come into Mexican soil and kill people here, very probably also with the help of the Mexican army. So these were two different groups of people that were not part of the initial idea of the commission, but we had to talk about them. And at the end, I think that we started the research that should be followed by other scholars and activists, because there is a lot to be known about that period.
So in that very same sense, there were some cases in the report, for instance, that you were interviewing people who were who faced forced disappearance, for instance, and then in the process of interviewing the people, you realize that there was also a number of women who were also targeted by the police forces and the Mexican authorities. That before the report, we didn't even know that they had been also part of the authoritarian practices of the regime.
This can be clearly shown in the case of Guerrero, where the army came into different communities, put men in jail or disappeared them, but they stayed in the communities for decades. In the case of Guerrero, very clearly, the state stayed there as the army stayed there as a central actor, and then many of their actors obligated women to marry them, and there were victims of sexual violence or reproductive violence over that time. Until now, the bibliography saw them as indirect victims of the period and not what they actually were, direct victims of the period. So we also try to cover all their stories, all their testimonies, and to give a new voice to those that were till now seen as collateral victims of this and not as what they were exactly, direct victims of the period. More importantly, women and children. This case, what I'm referring to is the case of El Quemado in Guerrero, where more than 40 people were put in jail, and the army stayed there for, I think, 12 or 14 years. No one had studied what happened over these 14 years, right? And because of the commission, many of these women spoke for the first time, and we were able to try to give new light to their stories.
So in general, Carlos, you would say that about over 8,000 people were affected by this type of tactics?
Yes, we found more than 8,000 victims over that period. This is obviously not a comprehensive number. It's just a number that we were able to identify and and to provide evidence to that. But by no means this is the comprehensive number, and by no means should be understood as the number of that. One of the recommendations we provide at the end of the report is to keep doing these sort of exercises. One of them is to go beyond the period of 1990, because state violence also went beyond 1990. And the second recommendation in that regard is to create local commissions that are able to really to focus on the specific human rights violations. But as in many other cases in Argentina or Uruguay, it's very difficult that a truth commission is able to come up with a number of those who suffer different kinds of violence. What we do know is that the number of victims is far beyond, is higher than the number that official reports until now pointed out. So it's higher, and the scope of violence was also, as I said, more widespread regionally and also in terms of the period.
As far as I understood, then you were able to document all of these cases, and that's why the number is more or less around 8,000 people. But because you were really precise in just including the cases in which you had evidence for it, but probably indicate a larger number of people.
And if you see the appendix of the report, you will find the number, the names and surnames of those who were victims as well. So we also try to give there a name for the first time, I think, in a report like this one. So we don't have just the names of the perpetrators, but also in many cases the names of victims. We don't know many names of other victims, but those that we knew about and we got information, we included their names in the report. This was a lot of work, of course.
And of course, a work like this requires a number of resources, and it was provided with a legal framework by a presidential decree on October 2021. So I know that this was part of the shift towards trying to move the Mexican state to accountability with the administration of AMLO. But at the same time, I do think that a report like this faced a number of challenges along the way, from not necessarily all Mexican institutions, but at least from certain agencies within the Mexican states that were not necessarily as open as expected. So can you tell us a little bit about the specific challenges that you encountered as you were writing and building the report and collecting the evidence? So concretely, the challenges that you encountered in forming the archive. And secondly, perhaps more generally, the challenges that came out because of the work that you were doing within the Mexican state.
Yes, of course. it is a very critical report against the Mexican army. And it's a very critical report against people who are still in power, even though it's a report that just covers the period 1965-1990, which is also evidence that the past is very much into our present, right? The fact that you're studying that period and still you see plenty of perpetrators in power. And it's a paradox, Fernando. Although the commission was created by a presidential decree, it has not been recognized by the presidency of the republic, very much because of the critiques towards the Mexican army. And if you ask me why, I would say that it has to do with the fact that the report draws lines of continuity with the present. It clearly points out that there are persistent factors and that impunity continues to our day. No? And again, it's a paradox because López Obrador is a president who supported the creation of an independent commission, but also needed the support of the armed forces during his tenure. No? And in the end, from my point of view, and this is just my point of view, I'm not talking in name of the entire commission, but just in my name, I think he had to choose between having their support of the military and continuing to support the work of the commission to see it through its ultimate consequences. No? Judging from it what happened, I think that he chose the support of the armed forces, and this explains a lot why the report was neglected and not accepted at all, not just by President López Obrador, but by the complete state. We didn't have the chance to present the report to the victims, to go again to those places where we interview people, and to try to present to them our main findings. So I'm very grateful to you and to the podcast and to those scholars that are still encouraging us to talk about the findings of the report, because we didn't have the chance to talk to a broader audience about the main findings of the report.
So generally speaking, truth commissions all over Latin America had faced the same challenges, right? The efforts to bring perpetrators to justice, at the same time to create legal mechanisms for long-term accountability, but facing the protection by state agents of specific embedded interests. And that happened even in the case of Argentina, which is probably the most well-known case of certain success, right? So the difficult nature of the work of truth commissions came out also in the Mexican case, as you are pointing out. But in the beginning, I believe that you were given the option, or at least it was contemplated, it was considered that you would present this report to the general public. So what changed along the way that made this a little bit more difficult for you? If you want to talk about that.
I think that the main issue again has to do with the critique to the military. My premise is that the government didn't know about how and why military actors were still, the perpetrators were still part of the present, and they didn't want to risk their alliance with the military. So at the end, when they knew what we were actually writing about, they decided to not to support the work of the commission anymore. You have to remember that elections were also taking place in Mexico in June, and in many senses, the report would put in doubt many of the premises of the four transformations. So I think that they decided, because of that, to neglect the report and not to provide the financial support that we needed, and not even to recognize how the state was also responsible of things that not just happened in the past, but are happening in the present. For instance, one of the main recommendations that we had is to rebuild the system to search for the disappeared. So this is something that the state could do and didn't do, right? Or to rename streets that still bear the name of perpetrators. This is something that can be done now, no, and it's not actually happening. Or more importantly, to create a special prosecutor's office for crime of the past. We still have the chance to bring those perpetrators to justice, right? But nothing happened in that regard. So in many senses, I think that the report was in general problematic to the narrative of the state, and because of that was completely neglected.
So you have touched on some of the recommendations that the report finally made. Can you walk us through some of these and repeat some of the main suggestions that in the end, the Truth Commission, the mechanism, and the report found, and how they could potentially inform future policies in Mexico?
Yes, like any other report, like any other Truth Commission report, we finished the report with a recommendation, something that, for instance, they dislike at the government. They said, hey, as a Truth Commission, you are not allowed to write recommendation. This is beyond the scope of your mandate. This is not the case. Every commission has to end their report with recommendations, because obviously with what we knew after finishing the report, we had a lot to say about the present, right? So it's obvious that we have some recommendations. At the end, I think we wrote more than 130 or 140 recommendations. This was a collaborative effort with many other NGOs in Mexico that brought also some theoretical findings to our recommendations. And we even divided them in short-term recommendation, long-term recommendation. And some of them were to demilitarize public security. We understood which are the risks in militarization, the public security. Again, to rebuild the system to search for those who are disappeared, to remain streets. It's incredible how in Mexico, even small towns and big towns still have the names of people that were perpetrators, to create a special prosecutor office of crimes, like the one in 2001, but with different pits and with different possibilities. And in general, Fernando, to build a new rights culture that does not forget the hundreds or thousands of missing persons in the past. If we want really to attend the current problematic of those who are disappeared, we have to look at the past and try to understand what happened to them and how, in many senses, the state is responsible for their disappearing.
Is it okay with you if you can share the names of all the other commissioners so we can
yes,
learn
of course.
about their trajectories and
they are great great persons. First of all, David Fernandez Dávalos, who is a priest, a Jesuita priest, who has been working for decades now in human rights. Abel Barrera, who is also a human rights advocate, is one of the leaders of Tlachinolan, one very important organization in the state of Guerrero. And Eugenia Alier, a well-known historian who her work has focused on human rights and forced disappearance in Mexico. We were a great team of researchers also doing this work. I have to say that we were not paid by any kind. We didn't receive any sort of remuneration for doing this work, but our team did become some salaries for their work. And to say that most of this, even like the complete work, were done by them, by this team of great historians, political scientists, anthropologists that carry on the interviews, that went to the archive. Even like there are too many to be named, but this work belongs mostly to them.
And I also think that the report is available online publicly for anyone with internet access to review it, right?
That's right. You just have to Google Mecanismo de Esclarecimiento Histórico, Mecanismo de Esclarecimiento Histórico, and you will find the complete link to the webpage, and I think that you will post the link in the show notes so that everyone can take a look. And there is also some like the first part of the archive of the report has been translated into English in the page of the National Security Archive. So if you want to read the first part of the archive in English, you can just go directly to the webpage of National Security Archive and to take a look at that translation, which is fantastic.
So this is truly an unprecedented report, Carlos, and I would like to thank you so much for joining us today. The report will be much commented in the future, and I'm glad that we were able to have the opportunity to present these to a larger audience. So thank you so much, Carlos.
No, thank you so much. This is a report for the present, but it's also a report for the future, and might give new opportunities for research for students, activists, and everyone interested in human rights violations, not just in Mexico, but across Latin America. So I think that the time of the report will come. And I'm really thankful to you, Fernando, Rose, and everyone involved in the podcast, because this is a great opportunity for us to talk in another language, in English, also about the main findings of this archive, and to explain the reasons why this report was and still is neglected by Mexican authorities. Thank both of you, and thank to everyone that listened to this podcast.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Then and Now on your favorite podcast platform and leave a review. Thank you so much again. Hopefully we'll have an opportunity in the future to meet again.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.